On May the 2nd, 1880, an annual tradition on Garrett Mountain near Paterson, New Jersey, escalated into a full-on riot that lasted for 9 hours, resulted in 3 burned buildings, the death of one man, and the injury of several. If you'd like to find out why, let's get to it. Paterson, New Jersey, the Silk City, is located just 15 miles from New York City on the Passaic River. It's home to a number of noteworthy sites, many of which you can visit today. There's the Great Falls National Park, Samuel Colt's Shooty Stick Factory, and a 600-foot cliff known as Garrett Mountain that offers picturesque views of Paterson and New York City. In the years following the American Civil War, many German and Irish immigrants would settle in Paterson, bringing with them many of their traditions from the Old World. In the case of the Germans, they held an annual festival to usher in the beginning of the warm season. Held on the 1st of May each year, Mayfest consisted of ascending the tallest nearest mountain and greeting the rising sun with songs, music, and of course, drinking. This was quite the festival. There were choirs, brass and string bands, and all other manner of merrymakers who attended the mountaintop ceremony and performed the Frühlingslied, I think I nailed that, which was then followed by a day of singing, dancing, and because they're German, drinking. The celebrants went to bed early the night before, embraced the early morning breeze, huddled by warming fires, and greeted newly arrived celebrants with shouts of joy. They wore garlands of flowering trees and carried bundles of May flowers. Generally, a nice, wholesome experience. And this brings us to the first of 2 iron laws of the universe. 1. As will become evident, Germans have 2 speeds, Speed 1 and Speed 2. More on that later. As for the second law, no matter how wholesome or innocent, wherever there is opportunity, someone will ruin it for everyone. By 1880, Paterson's Sangerbunde, again I think I nailed that, the Sangerbunde had observed this Teutonic tradition for 30 years. In such time, the music and wide availability of German lager attracted a younger, somewhat rowdier contingent. Vandalism, in particular, started to become a problem. At any rate, there were more revelers, and it became necessary to expand the established routes up to the top of the mountain. On one of these routes, the damage was so bad that one resident with a house, a farm, and 60 acres abandoned his tenement after only 1 season. This property would eventually be rented by William Dalzell, a man with quite the reputation. William Dalzell, aka Devilish Dalzell, was an Irish immigrant who grew cabbage and potatoes and sold them at his grocery store on Grand and Pine Streets in downtown Paterson. Aside from the grocery store, he also owned a block of buildings, a home on Pine Street, and rented the property on Garrett Mountain. We're not entirely sure what he looked like, but I think this captures him quite well, so we're going to use it. Bill had quite the reputation around town as, quote, an out-and-out crank. On one occasion, a drunk patron threw potatoes at Dalzell in his grocery store, and in response to this act of Irish sacrilege, Dalzell then proceeded to beat him unconscious, and then while he was passed out, cut him with a knife. Another time, he was confronted by a disgruntled customer with a pistol, and so responded in kind. Thankfully, the police intervened during this altercation before anyone could become hurt. During this altercation. Now, one would think that a reputation of this sort would cause people to give Dalzell a wide berth. This guy is full on, get off my lawn, and at least a little bit unhinged. Let's not bother him. Nope. Sunday, May 2nd, 1880. Around 6 a.m., the rising sun is greeted with singing and music on Garrett Rock, and all in all, the May Day celebration is going off as planned. As has become tradition, some of the crowd cut through Dalzell's property. One sympathizes. Now, as it's going to become quite apparent, there's a lot of conflicting accounts over this story, and I'm going to try and parse it out as best I can. Per Dalzell's account, he was well aware of the German tradition, and indeed referred to them as a quiet and orderly people. Clearly, he's thinking about Speed 1. Thus, he made accommodations by opening part of the fence to create a preferred path, one that would keep them away from his crops. The issue occurred when a crowd of young loafers followed the main progression and, according to Dalzell, were known to cause trouble. This will be the Van Houten group. We'll get to him in a minute. Dalzell and his son Robert left the Pine Street house and went up to the mountain property that morning to check up on things. It is worth noting that Dalzell did in fact see fit to arm himself upon leaving the house. Once on the farm, he observed a sizable crowd of revelers cutting through his hayfield outside of the preferred route. Chief among them was Joseph Van Houten, a carpenter well liked around Paterson and the stepson of an ex-alderman. An alderman is kind of like a mayor, but for one district of a city. Robert went to ask them to leave, and to be fair, some complied. However, some 200 still remained, and they were feeling stubborn. Now, this is where accounts are going to conflict, so I'm going to preface this by saying it's Dalzell's account. He claimed that some of the young troublesome loafers contingent refused to go and responded to his demands to leave by immediately throwing rocks. While this is plausible, so too is the likelihood that Dalzell was being a prick about it. When confronted by Robert, Joseph Van Houten stepped up and the two of them started to fight. Meanwhile, someone else started throwing rocks at the guy with the gun. As the great Scotsman once said, in the business, they call this foreshadowing. Enter Dalzell Sr., who stood nearby, resting his double-barrel shotgun on the fence. His claim, and I stress this word claim, is that he only meant to scare the crowd away. What is beyond dispute is that he did bring a gun to a rock fight, albeit on his own property. However, considering the fact that the crowd responded to the sudden appearance of an armed man with heckling and mockery, it might lend credit to the idea that he was not perceived as a genuine threat. Up until now, Mess Around had been running the show, but was just seconds away from Find Out showing up for Act 2. What followed next is a matter of some debate. By Dalzell's account, he fell backward under a hail of rocks, and the gun went off accidentally, while others claim that he fired intentionally, and we may never know the actual truth. One can certainly see the incentives for embellishment on either side. What no one disputes is where the shot landed. While several bystanders were tagged by lesser amounts of scattered buckshot, Joseph Van Houten stopped most of it from reaching the ground all by himself. Right then and there, he died on the spot. Dalzell had made his intentions clear. Now he was standing in front of a crowd of 200 people with an empty gun. Things were about to get real ugly. As the Van Houten crowd prepared to escalate from speed 1 to speed 2, how did Dalzell respond? Did he attempt to de-escalate and apologize? Did he implore the crowd to listen to reason and vacate his property before anyone else got hurt? Or did he engage in a comically impromptu retelling of the Three Little Pigs? You can probably guess. Yes, it was C. First, he ran into a house made of hay. The crowd charged, and Dalzell retreated into his barn, where he reloaded. A standoff ensued, with Dalzell standing inside the door, threatening to shoot anyone who approached. Evidently recalling that he had in fact just shot a dude like a minute before, the crowd did keep their distance. During this prolonged standoff, they got to work. Say what you will about Germans, but Speed 2 is an organized people. One group started gathering rocks and proceeded to mercilessly pelt the barn in which Dalzell and his son Robert were hiding. At the same time, another started asking around for matches. Around the time that word finally reached the city, the barn had been set on fire, forcing the Dalzells to vacate and flee to 2. A house made of sticks. Since what this riot needed was the involvement of more innocent bystanders, Dalzell fled to the next building, which was his neighbor's house. Sources are again flaky on who this house belonged to. One said it was owned by a Mr. John Ferguson, another referred to a Mr. Wilson, and occupied by the Holland family. I'm going to stick with the Holland family. The Dalzells fled inside, and the exchange probably went a little bit something like this. Oh, hey, neighbor, you enjoying the Mayfest celebration? Gee, looks like there's a big angry crowd outside. What's that about? Oh, they're here for you. In short order, the Holland family yeeted out the back, wisely taking no part in the excitement to come. Following that, the stone throwers quickly redirected and then proceeded to knock out every piece of glass in the structure while the fire-setting contingent caught up. Unfortunately, the Hollands themselves were briefly mistaken for the Dalzells and got roughed up before the crowd realized their mistake. Meanwhile, perched in a window on the front of the house, Dalzell decided to open fire again. Thankfully, he didn't kill anyone this time, but the indiscriminate shooting injured a man and a young girl. In total, he would fire 2 to 3 times. This at last may be what eventually pushed the crowd entirely over the edge. Where before they were jeering and mocking a local grouch, now they were out for blood. As they fully transitioned from Speed 1 to Speed 2, a third group started looking around for a length of rope and a sturdy tree. The May Day celebrants were quickly turning into a lynch mob. The Hollands' house, too, eventually caught fire, much like the barn did, forcing the Dalzells to flee once again. This time to 3, a house made of bricks. Thankfully, word had reached the city. While it attracted more rioters as well as simple observers, swelling the mob to well over 1,000, it also stirred the police and government into action. Constable James Riley and Detective Louis Tiedemann were first to arrive and intervened on the Dalzells' behalf. These cops would stick with them for the rest of the siege. When the Dalzells fled for a third time, Riley and Tiedemann stuck with them. While their presence gave pause to the crowd, it did not quell their anger entirely, and so during their dash across Garrett Mountain, the party sustained a hail of rocks and stone thrown by the rioters. The Dalzells and the cops soon reached the home of Mr. McGuckins, whose family slipped out the back before they took refuge. Safe again, but it became obvious now that they were seriously outnumbered. Undeterred by the presence of the law, the crowd continued throwing whatever was at hand. In short order, every window in the house was smashed. Ironically, it was during this barrage that several more bystanders were injured, not by Dalzell, but by the mob itself.
Ironic.
This included one young girl who suffered a concussion. The cops laid low while reinforcements were called up. Unfortunately, this was easier said than done. Paterson Police Chief Frederick Rawl, a veteran of the Paterson Department, commanded 24 men. Even if all of them could be called up, and at this hour many were still in bed, it would still be woefully inadequate against the Mayfest mob, quickly surpassing 1,000 in number. It wasn't long before the Passaic County Sheriff, Albert A. Van Voorhees, was tagged in. In most jurisdictions, the sheriff has the power to deputize individual citizens, and it was hoped that he might be able to pull in more guys to help pacify the crowd. Around mid-morning, Sheriff Van Voorhees, Deputy Sheriff Drew, along with Paterson Mayor Joseph Graham and City Councilman Griggs, reached the property where the Dalzells and their police escorts were besieged. Mayor Graham got in front of the crowd and stated earnestly that the perpetrator had been detained and implored for the crowd to let justice do its work. They simply weren't having it. See, the rioters were of the opinion that the Democrat-run city could not be trusted to fairly enforce the law and that the police were corrupt. This was 140 years ago. Furthermore, the Amateur Noose Tying Club had already made the knot and picked out a tree, and as far as they were concerned, Dalzell was not leaving this hill, but carried feet first. And if they had to burn down another house in order to do it, well, the matches were already warm. While the mayor distracted the fiery but mostly peaceful lynch mob, Sheriff Van Voorhees quietly slipped away back to town. It was now clear to him that the crowd was not going to be swayed by any words, and now they were threatening officers' lives. To reiterate, by this point they had seriously injured a half-dozen people in addition to those who had been shot and burned down 3 different buildings. So this is pretty much Van Voorhees' concern when he reaches out to the first of the proverbial big guns, the Paterson Light Guard. Back in January of this year, the Paterson Light Guard was organized under Joseph W. Congdon. This was part independent paramilitary organization and part social club, but with the intent to fully integrate with the New Jersey National Guard, something which would happen a few weeks later, but was not yet available. Van Voorhees reached out to Congdon, requesting assistance from the Light Guard's 200-some members to effect crowd control. However, Congdon declined on legal grounds since they were not yet official members of the Guard. Also, apparently they didn't actually have ammo for their guns. Rookie mistake, you hate to see it happen. After the fact, it was suggested that the real reason the guard declined action was that they either had friends among the rioters or otherwise harbored some ill feelings toward Dalzell and felt he deserved whatever happened at that point. I couldn't find anything definitive one way or the other, so take that as you will. Van Voorhees decided to kick things up the chain and started making calls to Brigadier General Plume, 4th Brigade of the actual New Jersey National Guard, located some 15 miles away. Once again, they were running into questions of legal propriety. For some reason, people at this time were very particular over when and how U.S. soldiers were to be deployed on domestic soil. Hint, the Civil War was only like 15 years earlier. Speaking of, Governor McClellan, a man with recent experience tending to rebellions, was on his property at nearby Orange Mountain, which is right between Newark and Paterson. He met with General Plume that afternoon, and the guard was put on standby, ready to board trains for Paterson to quell the rioters should the need arise. However, that call never came. In the end, Sheriff Van Voorhees lucked out. See, Grace Church had burned to the ground the night before, in, believe it or not, a completely unrelated incident. Just lucky. And so by mid-morning, this whole crowd of people who had nothing to do with the riot currently in progress on Garrett Mountain was just milling around on Main Street. Van Voorhees grabbed as many of them as he could and deputized them en masse. Around 11 a.m., this posse was armed with pistols if they had them, but also clubs and tools, basically whatever was on hand. And so they marched up the mountain to aid the other police. Back on the mountain, the riot had turned into an oddly carnival-like atmosphere as Speed 1 put in a brief reappearance. I mean, aside from the injuries and the anticipated murder, those that weren't directly in on the action of throwing rocks or squaring off with the cops were drinking and singing. Bear in mind, this was approaching midday and the crowd had grown to something like 5,000 people. Van Voorhees and his new deputies arrived. Unfortunately, aside from their brandished weapons, they wore no common uniform or official badge, and so the now properly drunken crowd flung more jeers and insults even in the face of this larger, albeit ad hoc force. Police Chief Frederick Rawle stood up to address the crowd. To paraphrase, he told them that mob law was no law, and that there was no doubt that Dalzell had committed the murder. Trust the justice system to do its job, and let the officers go with no further violence. A reasonable request. And surprisingly, this seemed to work. See, Rawle was a longtime veteran of the force and well known around town, and so his speech was well received. The crowd quieted for a moment, and it seemed like that might be the end of it. However, Dalzell and his escorts made it 4 steps outside the house before someone got lucky with a hit from a single large rock, which clocked him in the temple and dropped him to the ground. Riley and Tiedemann pulled him back into the stone house, and the siege resumed. Precisely when is unclear, but at some point Dalzell Jr. became separated from his father and escaped back to town on his own, thankfully avoiding the crowd and any further injury. In response to this latest literal rock concert, Mayor Graham stood up and made another speech, once again imploring the crowd to disperse, and as before, they exhibited no intent to do so. Graham then tried a new strategy and started directly engaging individual citizens. Many of them all had the same very specific complaint. There's been a dozen murders in Paterson recently, and no one's been hung. This one will be. This accusation of murderers going free was repeated multiple times, by the way, and I couldn't find anything else about it, but I just thought that was interesting. It's now 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Things were growing desperate. By this point, the authorities started to believe that now the rioters intended to wait until nightfall, at which point they would rush the house and kill Dalzell then. There was a ticking clock element at work now. To make matters worse, some of the individual Light Guard members were now attempting to join the sheriff as individual constables. However, still without ammo, they proposed to use fixed bayonets for crowd control. Yeah, this was winding up to get real damn ugly. The town coroner, a Mr. Hurd, who was on site attending the late Mr. Van Houten, was the next to nicely ask everyone to go home. As before, they generally declined. However, unlike before, this time about 20 men stepped forward from the crowd and offered to help escort Dalzell back to town. But, as before, as soon as Dalzell was outside, all hell broke loose. Another barrage of high-capacity assault rocks rained down upon the prisoner and his escorts, and the whole convoy was compelled to run half a furlong, or 110 yards if you're not a Victorian era journalist, to the next and last house where they all took refuge once more. Coroner Hurd gave it his best. A second speech at this latest house yielded a few names willing to testify in court, so progress. However, the amateur news tying club was having a hell of a turnout, and still no one was leaving. Hurd ultimately yielded the podium when another public figure stepped in to try his hand at this really awful open mic night. William McNulty, an Irish Catholic priest, intervened on behalf of Dalzell. Since many of the city's German residents were also Catholic, he figured this was worth a shot. His message was simple, and playing the cleric with maxed out charisma, he decided to throw the holy card. Hey, folks, so, it's Sunday, you know? Can't murder a dude on Sunday, right? Wouldn't be very Christian. And it actually worked. See, McNulty was a pretty popular guy, a skilled public speaker, and the people genuinely cheered him. That Dalzell was a Northern Irish Orangeman, and McNulty was a Catholic probably helped to sway the crowd to no small degree. Just Google Irish Catholic Protestant split when you get out of here, and you'll see why this was kind of a big deal, especially in the 1880s. Meanwhile, 100 police, sheriff, deputies quietly made arrangements. While the crowd's attention was on McNulty, a carriage was brought up the road. When it neared the house, Riley, Tiedemann, and Dalzell ran out. They piled into the carriage and took off. However, while the crowd had not been paying attention at first, they sure as hell were now. The carriage was still within throwing range, and they had not yet exhausted the mountain's supply of pointy rocks. Seeing this, McNulty jumped aboard the bench, meat shielding the Dalzells and their police escort. This seemed to work, but no one really cared to find out for how long, and the horses took off at top speed, with McNulty standing and holding on for dear life the whole time. One or two athletic rioters decided to get some wind sprints in and caught up, attempting to board. This time, the police were less interested in asking nicely and instead clubbed them until they changed their mind. It only took the whole of the crowd a few seconds to realize what had happened, and they soon gave chase. However, this time the cops had a plan. Rounding a corner, they ushered Dalzell out of the first cab and into a second one in a baby driver type escape. The crowd followed the decoy cab all the way to the police precinct, logically assuming that would be one would take a murder, allegedly, before they found out that he was not in fact inside. You see, realizing that the crowd would not quit, the authorities went with the time-honored tradition of fake news overload. They first started a rumor that Dalzell had been taken to the then new Essex County Penitentiary in Caldwell. Several hundred people started walking, and the roads were soon filled before they realized the subterfuge. Upon returning to Paterson, the truth at last came out. Dalzell had been detained in Newark, in the opposite direction. However, by this time night had fallen, and the energy of the crowd had at last been expended. Finally, Dalzell was out of immediate danger. The real carriage took Riley, Tiedemann, and Dalzell to Newark, and they arrived at the jail by 4 p.m., where he was booked on the charge of murder. After that, things quieted down. Dalzell's wounds were tended, Sheriff Van Voorhees finally took a break and dismissed most of his special constables. From his cell, Dalzell gave an interview to a reporter from The Sun. Meanwhile, the rumor mill was busy at work. Around Newark, it was circulating that several buildings had been burned down by roving marauders, and that a revolt between the working men and the property owners was currently in progress. Tangent here, this is what I love about history. The same stuff just keeps happening over and over again. Even before, they considered banning another May Day celebration at Eagle Rock on Orange Mountain, and this kind of cinched it. No drinking in the park. Ruining it for everyone. It's been noted that the police generally appeared sympathetic to Dalzell's version of events. I'll point out that a lot of rocks were thrown their way, so make of that what you will. A crowd gathered at Dalzell's home on Pine Street the following evening, May 3rd, threatening to burn it down, since they'd had some practice. But the police dispersed them without incident this time, so win. In total, the injuries were considerable on all sides. All 24 of Paterson's usual officers, plus every sheriff's deputy and special constable, sustained cuts and bruises to varying degrees. Special policeman William Jones, I think that's code for deputized citizen, suffered a fractured skull, again due to flying rocks. On the rioters' side, Mary Sheridan, suffered a broken nose and lost an eye to flying rocks. James Murphy was shot in the face, non-seriously, by Dalzell. The little girl that took a glancing blow of buckshot thankfully made a full recovery. In the end, Van Houten was the only fatality. A little post-production note here. I just wanted to note that Joseph Van Houten's funeral was the following weekend and was attended by some 2 to 3,000 people and was really a big community event. So just to kind of underscore how unpopular Dalzell was at this time and how he was very much blamed for the events that happened. Now sitting in jail, Dalzell turned quiet, perhaps not necessarily with a heavy heart, but stoically accepting whatever fate might become him. He met with his lawyers. Dalzell, being a landowner and businessman, was able to assemble a crack legal team. Considering the deck stacked against him at this point, unbiased jury, anyone? Let's face it, he needed all the help he could get. The team included John Griggs and Socrates Tuttle. These were some up-and-coming movers and shakers in the Garden State. Griggs would later be elected governor in 1896, and Tuttle would serve as U.S. Attorney General in the McKinley administration. So these guys knew their business, and the first thing they did was get the trial moved out of the county. Tuttle would argue, rightfully so, that it was impossible for Dalzell to get a fair trial in Passaic County. Considering that a lynch mob of some 5,000 people just tried to kill him, yeah, I'd say he got a case there. Instead, the trial was held in Bergen County, to the east. At the time, it was heavily agrarian, and local farmers held property rights in extremely high regard. An enlightened people. According to one reporter, it wasn't beyond them to hang a man for stealing so much as a cherry. Figuratively speaking. I think. Tuttle's thinking was that they'd be somewhat more sympathetic to what Dalzell was arguing was legitimate defense of property. And it worked. Dalzell was acquitted, and so he went back to his grocery store and minded his manners from that day forth. Except for when he sued the city for $651, a considerable sum back then, due to damage to his property. Kind of ballsy, considering the legendary defense they posseed up on his behalf. Several lawsuits against individual trespassers were brought, but they fell apart. Perhaps needless to say, the 1881 May Day celebration went on as planned, but was a much subdued event. Recalling the events of the previous year, Dalzell's farm had been repaired and augmented with several no trespassing signs. After that, it's radio silence for devilish Dalzell until 1920, when, at the age of 92, he passed away, still a Paterson resident. Well, that'll about wrap it up for me. If you stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. All sources in the description. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.